Welcome. This is Stephen Lee, and this is Life and the Living of It. I had a friend recently ask me, what do you expect you praying for me to ever accomplish? Yeah, I have friends that ask questions like that. And I knew I would have to explain so many things to her before I could even begin to explain my answer. First, I told her, let me say that the way I pray is very different than the typical folded hands, closed eyes, bowed head. I pray with feelings, with emotions, with visions, and sometimes, occasionally, I use words. First, I have to acknowledge that praying for you might not accomplish anything that's visible to either of us. That happens. And this is always a possible outcome of prayer, that seemingly nothing happens. It is also equally possible that prayer does accomplish something, but we don't recognize that until days, weeks, months, or years after the prayer. And yet neither invalidates praying. Neither means prayer doesn't have any power or force for change. Then I went on to say that for me, prayer is how I interact with the greater power that I call God. But it's also the way I interact with the people of God. When a person is not directly in front of me, nor in a place or a space in which we can really talk about things, or if they're halfway around the world, I interact with them in prayer. And yes, sometimes I do this without using texts and emails and instant messages and Zoom, though those are vehicles of prayer as well. And I told my friend of a time when she was in emotional turmoil, when she felt abandoned, discarded. I told her I remember time picturing the ties between her and the people around her. And I prayed that situations and events would bring them to a place where true forgiveness and healing even had the possibility of taking effect. Though even if those things did not happen, I prayed, I visualized, I saw their heart, her heart, and the wounded slowly begin to heal. I saw her surrounded by the wind, not the kind that rips you off from the ground, but the kind that gently reminds you of the peace and the calm and the cool breeze and the comforting wafts of air on a hot day. And I realized that there might still be hurt between the relationships that she was in, that not all the wounds would heal, and also recognizing that the rejection she felt had not and would not become the end-all be-all of her existence. Sometimes prayer is just recognizing that whatever hurt someone is going through or that I'm going through is not going to be the end-all be-all of our existence. I prayed that bone cancer would not define me as a cancer person, but rather a person who happened to survive cancer. That her betrayal would not mark her as a betrayed woman, but rather a woman who experienced betrayal. And I realized while saying this to her that I had not yet answered her question. Does that kind of prayer mean anything? Especially if the person for which that prayer is being said has not at the time experienced anything good at all. Can you pray, and is that prayer valid if the other person is still going through pain and shame and blame and feeling like trash and feeling discarded and feeling worthless and feeling trauma and feeling hurt? I mean, from the inside perspective, it doesn't seem like other people praying for her made any difference at all. And sometimes when people have prayed for me when I've been going through really rough times, I don't feel any difference at all either. And yet, something happens. So again, I tried to explain it. For me, praying for you is an act of will to place my heart and mind, my soul and body in a place where they all communicate, make contact, connect with your mind, your heart, your spirit, your body. That by visualizing the Spirit moving in your life, I feel closer to you. I am more in connection with you. I also find that I love you more. I find more in you to love. And as I was saying this to her, I felt the truth of this. I was more connected. I did love her more. I said, if my prayer does nothing else, it brings me closer to you and causes me to love you more. I've also come to know that as I am brought to a place of peace, or at least less inner turmoil over your turmoil, that somehow, as we are connected in the Spirit, that peace is to some degree shared with you. And that peace that may come upon you, and from your perspective, happens for no reason. And maybe it's just a moment. And maybe that peace doesn't happen when I'm praying, but happens afterwards. But then I realized there's even more that happens in prayer. And I told her that prayer, because it's an act of will, it's doing something. I am not praying for her to do something specific, because that invalidates free will. But I am doing something in praying for her for myself. I may feel her problems are totally out of my control, except I do pray. So I'm doing something. The second is that I don't pray and expect it to be answered if that prayer is to change you in a particular way. For one thing, I'm not you, and I don't know what would change and what those changes might mean for you. I don't particularly know the solution to your problems because they're yours. I might think I know the best course of action for you, but then I'm invalidating your free will by praying for God to have you or make you do something specific like that. And I know out of experience those prayers are not answered, or not answered specifically. What I can and do pray is that you are brought to a place where there are other possibilities. Other choices become apparent. I do not pray for specific choices, but other choices. I know personally in my life, when I get into survival mode, I become myopic. The choices are usually very narrow by then because I only look at the possible risks and costs. And while looking at risks and costs, there actually may be 10 choices to make, but I only see 2, and I only choose from 2. Most of my prayer for other people is for them to see other possibilities they see even as they are in survival mode, praying that they see other ways of seeing things and experiencing things and judging things and choosing from things. Lastly, I told her praying is a way that I can love you at any time, in any place. That act of love is reaching out and connecting. It is a way of putting into action my deepest desire for her to have her deepest desires realized in her lifetime. That prayer is not only an act of will and an act of love, but of faith and a reconnection with God in both her life and mine. And then she says, well, what good is it if the deep desires of my heart don't come true? Which is another really good question. And I told her I have 2 answers for this. One is that the things that I pray to happen in my own life, I only see sometimes years later. I realize after the fact that I've had a prayer answered in a way that was unexpected. That if in fact God answered certain prayers in the specific ways I wanted them answered, my life would have been in a much worse place. I would have been hurt more, or disillusioned more, or traumatized more. Because again, in survival mode, when I'm hurting in the first place, I don't make the wisest decisions, and I don't see decisions that I could make otherwise that would be helpful. Though part of my faith is recognizing God does. And then an example came to mind that there was a time when I was in my first serious relationship that I prayed to God that we get married and have children and live out our lives together. And that just didn't happen. And when the relationship was strained, I prayed that God would fix it, that we could still be together forever. And that didn't happen. It was only years later that I realized that we were so different in our approaches to life and in the ways we perceived things and in our underlying assumptions about life and living and marriage and children, that had we gotten married, I'm almost sure we would have been divorced soon after. And finally, when I got to that point, I could pray a prayer of thanksgiving that God didn't answer my specific prayers back then. The second part of the answer I touched upon before, but prayer is an action. A lot of times I feel powerless to ease her pain and make her life richer and have her experience love to a greater degree. I'm powerless to have people treat her right, with dignity and with respect, and valuing her. I certainly have no power to fundamentally change every aspect of her life. And so in my powerlessness, I turn to the one power I do have, and that is to engage with God on her behalf. Now, some people say if you can't do anything, pray. I would say regardless of how little or how much you can do, pray. Simply in the process of doing something, prayer, sometimes I come to know better my needs, their needs, her desires. Prayer causes me to think through what may be best for her, but also to come to the conclusion that I actually don't know what's best, and I'm going to leave that in God's hands. And then I told her just doing something like praying, even if you don't believe the prayer will come true, and even if you're not in the habit of praying, and even if you just set your mind in the direction of God without words, and open up your heart and just feel towards God, that is doing something. In the process of sharing your needs and your desires, sometimes you realize what needs and desires those really are, what's actually missing from your life, or what you have too much of in your life, or who you have too much of or too little of in your life. And I said another thing my praying for you does is that you know someone is out there asking reality itself on your behalf to be changed, so that the possibility of choosing something that will bring you greater love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control is always going on. That I am on your side and in your corner. Also that I am connected to the source of love, which also helps to change reality in such a way that your life moves towards something that will be richer and more full of love. That ultimately the very core desires of your heart will be fulfilled. And the last thing about prayer is that whether she prays or I pray or whoever prays, we don't need to know the shape of the future that we are praying for. We don't need to know the specific ways God is going to answer the prayer or the timetable at which God answers. Actually, we don't need to know anything except we love someone who needs prayer, and we share that with God. And I have faith that you are more likely to move in directions that bring you closer to having the true desires of your heart fulfilled in ways neither one of us can predict. And all of that is prayer. And this is life and the living of it.